Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, some of the offensive low-hanging fruit for the Wolves this year. How can they improve offensively relatively easily? I say relatively, but what are some areas that they could clearly improve on, and how will Julius Randle contribute to that? Plus, we have Timberwolves basketball tonight. Wolves-Lakers, we'll talk a little bit about that, what to expect from the Lakers. We'll get to that toward the end of the show today. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to us by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Happy Friday, everybody. Happy weekend. And believe it or not, it's our first Timberwolves game day of the 2024-25 season. Kind of. It's preseason. But there is a game tonight. Timberwolves at Lakers this evening from California. It's a real thing. It's happening. No idea at this point, recording this, Thursday evening, who's playing, who's not playing. I said on Thursday's show, look, I don't know who, if any of the new guys are going to play. They did become official till Wednesday. But Chris Finch sounded like, when he talked to the media on Thursday, there was a chance those guys could see the floor Friday. I mean, it's basketball. It's not like they need to learn a full playbook to get on the field like they would in football, right? So, who knows? Maybe those guys will play. But we'll talk a little bit about that toward the end of the show. I want to dig into the Wolves' offense and Julius Randle's impact in some areas the Wolves should be able to improve relatively easily this season, going from some of their issues last year to this year. So we'll get to that here in just a moment. A big thank you off the top for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. All right, let's talk about some needed offensive improvements. And I touched on a couple of these briefly on Thursday, and that was in the wake of what Chris Finch talked about to the media on Thursday. Actually, I think it was going back to media day on Monday. Finch talked about some different areas that the Wolves could improve on offensively. He talked about end-of-game execution. He talked about turnovers, and he talked about playing more in transition. And on Thursday, I added a little bit more color to that in terms of when the Wolves ran, when they didn't. So I want to talk a bit more about that today, and specifically about what Julius Randle can do to impact each of those areas of the Timberwolves offense that need to be improved. Let's start with transition. And again, last year, the Timberwolves ended up, depending on where you look, they were 28th in transition frequency over at cleaning the glass, and that's what we really focused on Thursday. Overall, as a team, I think they were 29th or 30th in terms of pace on Basketball Reference, similar measurements there. But no matter how you slice it and dice it, they were a bottom 3 transition team last year. Taking it a layer further, cleaning the glass tells us that they were 20th in running after steals, which is not great, but it's fine. It's better than 30th, better than 28th. But they were dead last. They were 30th in running off of defensive rebounds. And that's something Chris Finch singled out that Julius Randle's really good at doing. So Monday he talked about running in transition, taking advantage of transition opportunities. On Thursday, separate interview, he talked about Julius Randle's ability to rip down a defensive rebound and initiate the break the other way. Not a coincidence that Chris Finch said both those things this week, that he enjoyed watching Julius Randle do that when he was the associate head coach in New Orleans and coached Randle in what I would call Julius Randle's breakout season, the 1 year he spent in New Orleans with Anthony Davis. That was back in 18-19, right before he went to the Knicks. Remember, he started his career at the Lakers, 4 years in LA, 1 year with the Pelicans, and then 5 years in New York. Wasn't an all-star until the 2021 season, okay? But the 1 year in New Orleans, he averaged 21 and 9, 21 and a half and almost 9, 3 assists per game, shot 34% from 3, which was actually his second best 3-point shooting season, period, in his career. Didn't shoot that many threes, but was really impactful in a number of different ways. The offensive rebound rate was solid. And as the going back to the pushing the pace and transition thing that Chris Finch brought up, that's something the Wolves didn't do last year, and that's something Julius Randle's really good at doing. Now he's a little bit older than he was then. He was obviously banged up a little bit last year. He's going to turn 30 like the week of Thanksgiving this year. So I don't know that he's the same in terms of athleticism or speed as 24-year-old Julius was when he played for Chris Finch in New Orleans. But Julius Randle still wants to push the pace, and he still likes to have the ball in his hands, and he's a good passer. Those things are all really positive. And defensive rebound rate wise, the Timberwolves last year, that was an area that was a bit spotty for them. We talk about how good the defense was. They ended up kind of fringe of the top 10 in terms of defensive rebounding, but the first half of the year, they were bottom half of the league. That was the one kind of bugaboo for what was otherwise a really dominant defense, was spotty defensive rebounding, allowing opponents to offensive rebound. And for a couple of reasons, but one of them was opponents really focused on it because they knew the Wolves weren't crashing the glass defensively. And they also just didn't have guards that rebounded super well going back a couple of years, obviously D'Lo and Jalen Noel and guys like that. Last year, it was a little bit better. And that's why over the course of the year, we saw them still be kind of a fringe top 10 defensive rebounding team. But all that to say, Towns individually, all of his rebounding numbers went down as he moved to the 4, which makes a lot of sense. He was guarding a little bit more on the perimeter. Obviously, was pulled further from the rim. His defensive rebound rate last year was just under 23%. When he was kind of his heyday rebounding wise, he was around 26+%, even had a couple years around 30%. Julius Randle last year was only 22%, but he also only played a half season. The 4 years before that, he was right around 25% in terms of defensive rebound rate. Karl-Anthony Towns hasn't done that in almost 5 years. I guess it would have been the 2021 injury shortened / COVID shortened season. He was 26%. The last 3 years, he was in the 22 to 23.5% range, 21.5 to 23.5% range. So Julius should actually be a slightly better defensive rebounder for his position. He's a little bit more physical than Cat. In theory, he shouldn't have to be on the perimeter all that much. But I guess he's, teams will try and get him in actions, and we'll see how the Wolves handle that. But they'll have a fairly switchable lineup at times, and Julius Randle's pretty good at defending in space for his size and his position. And in some ways, I would say is better than Cat at defending in space. And I know Cat was great against Kevin Durant. I know that Cat was great against Jokic, which is a different archetype of player you're guarding. But in terms of one-on-one against wings, Randle's not great, but I actually think he's got a little bit better lateral quickness than Cat in those types of situations, a little bit more physical. He's a little bit smaller. The reach isn't quite what Cat's is. But all that to say, that's not going to hurt the Wolves. So the defensive rebounding, the ability and the want to push the ball in transition, Randle's going to rip it down and run. Karl-Anthony Towns didn't do that very often, right? Cat was usually looking for a guard, especially the last couple of years, and wasn't actually pushing the pace himself. Randle will push the pace himself. And as I talked about overall with transition, the Wolves last year were dead last in running off of defensive rebounds. And there's really no reason for that. I get it. The Wolves want to play less possessions because they have such a dominant defense, and that makes sense in theory. But when you're so offensively challenged in the half court, which they shouldn't be, which is a whole other topic, and they got to shore that up. They got to find some fixes there. But what's the easiest way to score? You're going to get open threes in transition. You're going to get to the rim. You're going to score on layups and dunks. You're going to get fouled and get to the free throw line. That's why getting out in transition is so vital for teams that may sometimes struggle in the half court. So especially lineups with no Anthony Edwards. If you've got, TJ Shannon's going to be a terror in transition. He is. He's a good shooter, great range on his three-pointer, aggressive going to the basket. Rob Dillingham should be great in transition. When you've got some of these guys on the floor potentially without Ant, those lineups need to push the pace. They absolutely do. And of course, Ant himself is great in the open court, but Ant likes to slow the pace down. A lot of that was on Anthony Edwards last year for playing slower. Chris Finch wants to play faster. And, if there's no Rudy, especially, but also if there's no Ant on the floor, why not play fast? Why not push the pace? And I think we're going to see a lot of Julius lineups with no Anthony Edwards. We talked about this, I think, on Wednesday's show, the possibility of staggering those guys in the rotation. Yeah, they'll start together. And, Nas may finish a game instead of Julius Randle or whatever, or maybe it's Randle and Nas and no Rudy, depending on the, kind of game flow, where the game's at and who the opponent is, what the matchup is. But over the course of the game, I think the Wolves will stagger Edwards and Randle a bit. And you may see bench units that have Randle as the guy with Dillingham, with Ingles, with maybe TJ Shannon, with Nickeil Alexander-Walker, maybe Jaden's with that lineup with Nas, and there's no Ant and there's no Rudy. And those are lineups where you want Randle to rip it and go. You don't want a slow possession that's going to end up with a Randle jab step and an 18-footer. You want Randle to take it and go. So I think that's low-hanging fruit for the Wolves to improve offensively, and I think Julius Randle can be a really big part of that. I want to talk about a couple of other things, related to overall offensive improvements, and then another Randle item too before we get to Wolves-Lakers tonight. It's all coming next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends over at Gametime. Gametime has a new feature called Gametime Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Gametime Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. There's plenty of different events you can get over at Gametime. I love all live events. That, of course, includes obviously sports, but also my wife and I will go to comedy shows. We'll go to concerts of all kinds, all musical genres, theater. She loves theater. I've grown to love it. Lots of options on Gametime for that. You can also toggle on their all-in pricing feature, which allows you to see your total up front. That means no surprise fees at checkout. Make sure to toggle on the all-in pricing feature to see that. I think it's super helpful. You can also get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy, which is another great feature. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account. Redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA. That's LOCKEDON NBA for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Gametime. All right, so we talked about transition. We talked about the Wolves pushing the pace a little bit off of defensive rebounds specifically, and also specifically with no Rudy on the floor and also no Ant on the floor, picking their spots and increasing their pace just a little bit to get some of those easy baskets. The other thing we talked about is, the other thing I'd like to talk about related to the Wolves offense and an area to improve for next year is offensive rebounding. And I didn't talk about this at all on Thursday. Finch didn't talk about it all either. It's not a big focus of the Wolves. It just isn't. Like the primary reason is they're such a good half-court defense. And frankly, they were just okay in transition last year defensively, but they were so dominant in the half-court, it didn't matter. Like it dragged up their issues in terms of fast break defense, transition defense, and it really buoyed their entire defense, not just buoyed it, but floated it all the way to the top. One of the best defenses in the last 30 years. And I'm not going to go into the numbers now. I've done it a ton, but it is. Look it up in terms of relative to the rest of the league, right? So the transition defense was just okay. That's one of the reasons, and it was so bad the 2 years prior that the Wolves put an emphasis on getting back defensively. If you're shooting a shot on the perimeter, you're in the corner, you can't get caught watching from the corner, right? You can't fade and fall over, and you can't fall over on a drive to the basket, especially when you're not getting fouled like Nas or Cat. You got to get back. And they improved last year. Overall, they were just 21st in the league in terms of offensive rebound rate as a team. That's still a little bit lower than it should be, especially when you've got Rudy Gobert. And now you've got Julius Randle, who's a marginally better offensive rebounder than Karl-Anthony Towns. I know. So I'll go back a couple of years for Cat, because the last two, well, actually, no, let's do it this way. So when Cat was a center, his offensive rebound rate was more like 9, 10, even 11% a couple of seasons because he was a center. He was around the rim. That's where he was. He was playing off the low block. He was crashing the glass more frequently with those bad teams. There were more missed shots to gobble up. That matters too. Although I guess rate kind of takes that out, but there were more opportunities for offensive rebounds, right? The last couple of years playing almost exclusively the 4, he was 5.5 to 6% offensive rebound rate. Well, Julius Randle also played the 4 for most of his career, he has, but especially the last couple of years. He was almost a 7% offensive rebound rate last year, just under 6% the year before. So over the last 2 years, Julius was about a point better than Cat in terms of offensive rebound rate, which is pretty close to an offensive rebound a game. Not quite, but almost an offensive rebound a game better than Karl-Anthony Towns. That's going to matter over the course of a season, assuming Randle continues to play that way. Now, the caveat here is Tibbs teams do crash the glass more than Finch's teams, at least we have more data with Tibbs, but Tibbs teams do gobble up offensive rebounds more frequently. That's just how his teams play. So that could factor in here. We may see Randle, like there may not be a negligible difference. This may be a very minor thing ultimately, but I think it's an opportunity for somebody who's a little more physical, a little bit more, we'll say in control of their extremities when it comes to crashing the glass. Randle's at the same time, it's phenomenal. He's more physical than Cat, but he also, offensive fouls a lot less, right? Like he's going to get in a lot less trouble in terms of charges and off-arm stuff and push-offs and all the stuff that Wolves fans know. I love Cat. We all love Cat. But that was his biggest bugaboo, right? Randle's somehow equal parts more physical and also less prone to those issues. The offensive foul rate is significantly lower for Julius Randle, and yet he's more physical. And I think offensive rebounding is an area for improvement for the Wolves. Not drastically. Like I'm talking an extra board a game on the offensive glass, right? Going from 21st in the league to, call it 15th in the league. I don't think that's out of the question. That's a little over a percentage point in terms of offensive rebound rate. Maybe that's a little aggressive, right? But move up a few spots, get an extra offensive rebound a game. Maybe it's an extra, that might convert to an extra, I don't know, point per game or a little more than a point per game over the course of the year. Again, it's incremental progress in areas where we're nitpicking because this team won 56 games last year, but the offense was still lower tier. I think the transition fast break is the biggest thing. But I think number two, maybe not number two, but another thing we haven't talked about a lot is the offensive rebounding. Number two is actually probably the turnover stuff. I spent a lot of time on that Thursday. I have some hope that the Wolves will improve in that category with no Cat, with no Kyle Anderson. Joe Ingles had a high turnover rate last year in Orlando, and he's effectively filling the slow-mo role for the Wolves. However, I don't think he'll play as much as he did with the Magic, especially now with DiVincenzo being added. Like, they've got 8 guys without Ingles. Ingles may be the 9th or 10th guy, depending on how TJ Shannon affords himself early in his NBA career. So we'll get an idea here early on. But I think that could help. Now, you've also got rookie backup point guard and Rob Dillingham, so we may end up in the same boat. But Chris Finch acknowledged, and I've been talking on the show since last year, like turnover rate is another controllable factor that the Wolves could certainly stand to improve in this season and beyond, and something to keep an eye on. Again, with the personnel they have, I think it's entirely possible that they improve there too. So if we have an incremental improvement in turnover rate, an incremental improvement in offensive rebound rate, and I would say a better than incremental improvement in transition, the only thing that's left is frequency of 3-point shots. And for the most part, like, the Wolves were really accurate last year. They were 3rd in the league in 3-point shooting when it was all said and done. They certainly started slower than they finished, but it was the frequency that was the bigger thing. Like, they just got to get more shots up. And what did they do this year in terms of personnel? Well, they got rid of the only rotation guy not named Rudy Gobert that couldn't shoot, and that was Kyle Anderson. Overall, their 3-point rate last year was 20th in the league, according to Cleaning the Glass. They only shot 35% of their shot attempts in the half court was a 3-point attempt. By contrast, they were 3rd in accuracy. They were a fantastic 3-point shooting team. They just didn't quite shoot enough. Now, part of that is Ant and his shot selection. And well, actually, let me rephrase that. Cleaning the Glass actually has them 1st in 3-point accuracy because it filters out garbage time and heaves. So if we're going to use Cleaning the Glass for one stat, we'll use it for the other one too. So they're 20th in frequency, number 1 in accuracy, number 1 in non-corner 3 accuracy. So above the break threes. There's certain individuals that are great at that. Ant is really good. Shot a lot of his threes above the break. We saw Nickeil Alexander-Walker maybe a little unsustainable, but his shooting percentage on above the break threes last year. Mike Conley was good from everywhere last year. So I think if the frequency could go up a little bit, and it should, when you lose Kyle Anderson and you bring in Rob Dillingham, who was lights out at Kentucky last year from 3. You bring in Joe Ingles, who's a 40+% 3-point shooter. TJ Shannon's more of a volume guy, but he should be around league average, and he's on the fringe of the rotation. And Donte DiVincenzo, who I've said, I think 3 or 4 times this week, number 3 in the league in 3-point makes and attempts last season, behind only Steph Curry and Luka Doncic. They now have a team full of guys that can shoot. Their top, like, if you want to go 11 deep in the rotation, you're still only talking Rudy Gobert as the only player that should not be a league average 3-point shooter. Everybody else can take them and make them. That's really going to matter over the course of a season and hopefully in a playoff series as well. It should matter in a playoff series. Wacky things can happen. We saw that, of course, last year. It always does. But you got to win some games in the regular season first. And I think this depth and the ability to shoot threes are really going to play into that in a big way. So, again, recapping this very quickly. More transition opportunities, especially off defensive rebounds. Less turnovers. I think the personnel will help. I don't know that it's playing style as much as it is just not making the dumb passes, like not dribbling the ball off your foot, not dribbling into a crowd. I don't know that it's anything else. Like, turnovers in transition weren't actually awful. It was just overall turnovers and a lack of transition opportunities taken advantage of. Offensive rebound and an incremental improvement there would be great, and then a higher frequency of 3-point shots. I didn't even get to free throw rate, which was pretty good last year. But Julius Randle's got a better free throw rate than Karl-Anthony Towns. We'll get to that when we do a season preview for Randle. But Julius is going to he gets the rim more often than Cat, and he should get to the free throw line a lot more often than Cat. Maybe not a lot more, but more than Cat. So those are additional easy points for the Wolves to get. Now, of course, losing Cat, even though you're acquiring a volume shooter like Julius Randle and other guys that can shoot like DiVincenzo, which saying he could shoot is an understatement, you're still losing Karl-Anthony Towns. So will the Wolves be the number one 3-point shooting team this year? I don't know, but they shouldn't. They shouldn't not be top 5, right? Because again, 10 of the 11 guys in the top 11 in this rotation are all plus average to plus 3-point shooters, and the other one's not going to shoot him. Julius Randle's the worst shooter on this team that's going to shoot threes. So that's going to play into it too, sure. But there's almost no world in which shooting more threes would be a bad thing for the Wolves this season. All right, let's close by looking at what's next for the Wolves preseason wise. We'll do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends over at FanDuel. Hey, NFL fans, you can start your season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. When you get a hunch in the middle of an NFL game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page that you place your bets. There's plenty of NFL games to look forward to this Sunday. There's a couple that stand out to me as reasonable lines that I feel like you could probably get after. Like, well, I don't know that I'd touch Falcons-Bucks. I thought I would. I actually don't hate the Vikings -2.5 in London over the Jets. It's not a true home game. It's in London. Don't miss that. Falcons-Bucks was last night anyway, by the way. I'm recording this just before Thursday Night Football. Jets-Vikings, though, on Sunday in London. That's an interesting one. Vikings -2.5. I don't mind that. I think they can cover that line almost no problem on Sunday in London. So check that out. Also, of course, NBA lines are there. We saw the Wolves not move after the Randle trade. The Knicks went up 1 in terms of win total lines over at FanDuel. You can get $200 to start with in bonus bets guaranteed once you place your first $5 bet. Again, place your first $5 bet. Get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed over at FanDuel. That's FanDuel.com. All right, believe it or not, the Timberwolves play basketball tonight with real uniforms, not summer league uniforms. They're going to be in Los Angeles to take on the Lakers, Los Angeles area to take on the Lakers. Actually, I don't know that they're playing. No, it's not a neutral site. I think it's actually the Lakers arena. So it's a 9:30 Central tip. The game's actually on NBA TV tonight against the Lakers. No idea who's playing, who's not playing. My assumption would be the guys that were acquired are not going to play, but Chris Finch made it sound like it was possible they would. So we will see if they play on Friday night. I would not recommend, well, go check it out on FanDuel anyway, but the Wolves, for whatever it's worth, are favored by 3.5 points tonight in Los Angeles. Who knows what's going to happen? This is such an early preseason game. I think, is it the actual first preseason game? I don't know. It's crazy that there's going to be, I think there's some games maybe during the day on Friday, actually. Anyway, so Wolves play the Lakers. The Lakers offseason, for what it's worth, not a whole lot happened there with LA. Obviously, they drafted Bronny James. They drafted Dalton Knecht, who's, I think, going to be a good pro. Nothing else of note. They let Taurean Prince go, old friend Taurean Prince. They let Spencer Dinwiddie go. They also let Skylar Mays go, who wasn't really in the rotation, but he's in camp with the Wolves and has a shot at making the team. The Lakers did nothing to improve, and I think they're going to be a fringe play-in team once again this year. Hard to say like what we're looking out for in Wolves Lakers in preseason. We don't know who's playing on either side. On the Lakers side, injury report wise, there's a bunch of guys that are like day to day. I think Christian Wood's out for a while, but that's kind of it. Still some old friends there like Jared Vanderbilt. He is always banged up a little bit. Would be shocked if LeBron played. Probably get a lot of Bronny in our lives on Friday night and a lot of LeBron cheering for Bronny. Anyway, so that's a 9:30 p.m. tip Friday night. What I'm going to do for the show, try and fire off some tweets during the game, like what we're seeing here, some posts on X from this preseason opener. Probably won't do a show till Monday. We'll do a Monday kind of something of a post-game pod from Friday night's game. Maybe get that up on YouTube Sunday evening following Wolves-Lakers. And then the Wolves preseason, like they have 5 games this year, and they're kind of rapid fire. The next one's not till the following Friday, but then it's like they have 4 in like 8 days. It's nuts. So they have like a week off now. They come home, they'll do like something of a real training camp, and then they play Philadelphia in Des Moines next Friday night, which is not a nationally televised game. The following Sunday, they're at the Knicks at Madison Square Garden. So Sunday, October 13th, and that's an ESPN game, a 5 p.m. Central tip. So who knows? Perhaps we see some cat against the Wolves at Madison Square Garden. I'm not sure if that's their first MSG game or not with Karl-Anthony Towns and a Knicks uni. And then they play at Chicago. So like 3 iconic road games, Lakers, Knicks, Bulls. And then they close out preseason with the only Target Center preseason game on Friday the 18th against Denver. Their first real game, though, is the following Tuesday. So I don't know how many guys are going to play in that one against Denver or how long they'll play. I think typically they play like, normal minutes in the first half and don't play in the second in that last preseason game. So all that to say, interesting preseason slate. I think my biggest thing, if the new guys play, it's what are the half-court sets looking like? Are they doing anything to try and unlock Dante DiVincenzo? We'll talk more about this as preseason goes on, but like as a movement shooter, are they doing any off-ball actions to free him up, get him some buckets, some easy three-point attempts? We haven't seen the Wolves do a whole lot of that in recent years. They just haven't had the personnel that's like their focal point. They can do it with Ant, but he usually has the ball in his hands. They can do it with Mike Conley, but a lot of time he's got the ball in his hands. So we'll see if they do some of that stuff. Curious to see how they use Julius Randle. If it's a lot of mid-post stuff like they did with Cat, makes sense to me. I think they will. How much is Randle operating if Ant's off the floor? Is he basically running the offense? Obviously, we're looking out for the rookies. We're looking for Rob Dillingham. What's he going to do in his first, we'll call it real, quote-unquote, NBA action? He played in Summer League. This isn't a real regular season game, but it's real NBA jerseys on a real NBA court in a real NBA arena against a real NBA opponent and real NBA players. So we'll see how Dillingham looks. He, of course, was a bit up and down in Summer League, as were some other guys. Also very curious, some of the players we haven't talked about recently, like Jalen Clark fighting for on a two-way contract, of course, coming off the injury. Is he going to have a shot at cracking some rotation minutes because of his defensive chops this year? Probably less likely even now with Dante DiVincenzo in the fold, but is somebody like him going to get on the floor? Probably gets a lot of Luka Garza in this game. So it's always fun. Josh Minott, of course, is a big one. Leonard Miller, guys that are going to be right on the outside looking in at the rotation. What do they look like and how are they deployed by Chris Finch in this game? So we'll talk about it. We'll see on Twitter during the game, and we'll talk about it on Monday's show. Again, we're daily, Monday through Friday, and going to start working through some player preview shows next week. This trade kind of threw everything off schedule-wise, so we'll get into player previews next week. That's all we got for you today. Big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. A big thank you once again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen today. For your second listen, go check out Locked On Fantasy Basketball. Become a fantasy basketball expert. Now's the time of year to do it. And get the edge over your league mates with daily tips from Josh Lloyd. Find Locked On Fantasy Basketball on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.